Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is George Duffield. And to help us talk about George Duffield, we need to welcome author of many books, but today we're talking notably about stories of faith and courage, Jane Hampton Cook. Jane, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Absolutely, it's always a pleasure. Now, we have a lot to talk about a fascinating character in George Duffield, who not a lot of people know about. So, do us a favor, give us a little background of George Duffield, who he was and what he was up to as things start to become revolutionary.
So, I first came across Duffield when I was writing my book, Stories of Faith and Courage from the Revolutionary War, because he was preaching at a church in Philadelphia, Pine Street. He was a Presbyterian minister. He was about the same age as George Washington. And in May of 1776, John Adams went to his church. And Adams wrote his wife Abigail a letter and said, this guy's a lot like the New England ministers. I really like him. And he said today he talked about and compared King George III with Pharaoh in the Old Testament and the conflict with Moses and the Israelites against Pharaoh. He compared that to America's problem with the tyrant King George III. And this really made an impression on Adams. And it's not that it didn't give Adams the idea to declare independence, but the fact that Duffield said it was time for a complete separation from England, that it was Providence's design, that I think emboldened and encouraged Adams that, hey, if ministers from the pulpit are making this comparison, then the people just might be ready to declare independence. So I think it gave him that encouragement. But then he also talks about Moses, Adams does, and that how Duffield, talked about Moses and Aaron, and Adams was, talking about he felt an awe upon his mind that was not easily described. And I think he was sort of searching for what is my role going to be in all of this. And we know that 2 months later, he played the role of Aaron and prepared the way for Thomas Jefferson, who played the role of Moses, if you will, in writing the Declaration of Independence. So Adams wasn't the declaration guy, but he paved that way so that Thomas Jefferson could use his great writing skills to write the Declaration of Independence. And so you can just see, the Adams's mind is working because of what Duffield said. And Duffield, of course, became a chaplain to the Continental Congress. And I every now and then I come across his name. And I found him the other day when I was writing a Memorial Day article and came across his name in the newspaper. So we can talk about that and more.
Absolutely, and I'll put a link to the article in the description down below, as well as to all of your books. You've written so many.
Yeah.
And now, as for Duffield, it's really fascinating to me that he uses the Pharaoh reference of all the biblical references. I suppose the fact that that story is extremely well known helps a lot, but the whole escape from slavery seems to be a theme of the American founders.
It is. And, they were looking at, I think they were looking at the fact that, okay, God freed the Israelites from the tyranny of Pharaoh. And so maybe it was God's plan to free America from the tyranny of King George III. And, they talked about it is for freedom that Christ came, therefore stand firm for freedom. And so they were tying all of these things together. And I thought that was just really interesting that they looked at Moses. And I saw it many times. I actually looked at some sermons from that time period and I saw it more than once. There was more than one minister who made that comparison. And then you see funny things that almost seem funny, the idea of, well, God put a big ocean between us, so maybe we really weren't supposed to be part of the same government after all. They looked at nature
Right.
and as reasons for it. So
Even though
but
they got on
just that.
boats and put the ocean between them
Yeah.
themselves.
Exactly. Exactly. So so that was kind of fun. And then but then I found something more serious. I was working on a Memorial Day article for genealogybank.com because I blogged for them. And I'd come across a story about Adams in 1777 looking at this mass grave that is now the tomb of the unknown soldier of the American Revolution. But then I found this affidavit in a newspaper where George Duffield has sworn an oath that this affidavit is true. And he talked about how after the Battle of Trenton, Mr. Rosborough, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but he was a chaplain, and he came across a group of Hessians who were hunting for food, and he surrendered to them as a prisoner. But instead of taking him prisoner, Duffield explained how they brutally slaughtered him on the spot. And this was just in many ways stunning because he was a chaplain and he had surrendered as a prisoner. And they, called him a blankety blank rebel minister as they killed him. And then the local people there buried this gentleman. So I just saw this big contrast between this small grave for this one soldier compared to the mass grave of 2,000 who had died in hospitals in Philadelphia at the same time. And so Duffield, I think that probably seeing a minister die for the cause probably hit him pretty hard as a minister himself. He realized that no one was immune to brutality.
Right.
And
Now
so.
I understand. What denomination was Duffield?
Duffield was Presbyterian.
Okay, and I understand that since Presbyterian generally at the time had an association with Scotland, and the Germans showed up being all Lutheran, that there was some tension there. Is there any chance that may have affected the Germans' attitudes toward the particular preacher?
That could have played a role, because one of the things I wrote about for the Washington Times a while back was that really the great diversity struggle of the founders was the issue of religion. They thought of themselves as very different because of their different religions and their different, denominations within Christianity. And of course, there were pockets of Jews living in different places too. And they had to tolerate each other's differences. And I don't imagine the Hessians were in any mood for toleration of those differences. But, even in the Continental Congress, they had this big debate. Hey, let's bring in a minister. Well, we can't because I'm a Presbyterian and I can't listen to an Anglican minister because that's against my religious beliefs. And they had this, little tiff. And Samuel Adams, who was known as the Puritan, stood up and said, hey, I am not a bigot. I can hear the prayer of a man who loves his country. And you see how that was something that they had to get over. And John Adams even said, that the American Revolution was more than a war. It was really a change in people's religious sentiments. Yeah. And I think that was part of it, was just saying, hey, we're going to have freedom of religion in America. And we're going to not let the Anglicans in Virginia arrest the Baptist ministers, which is something James Madison and Thomas Jefferson picked up on.
Right.
So you see that, that was something they had to learn to tolerate.
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring that up about Samuel Adams, because it's much overlooked in his storied career. A lot of what he does in his early life is obviously in Boston and starting a war. But he doesn't contribute a ton on the national stage. He obviously signs the Declaration of Independence, but then kind of becomes an anti-federalist and goes back. But as you said, they didn't know if they could literally hear the words of an... I just want to reiterate what you said. Like, they could not hear the words of another minister without essentially going to hell. And the fact that Samuel Adams stood up and said, no, no, no... I believe the quote was, I can listen to the words of someone who loves their country, right?
Right, yeah, I am not a bigot.
Right.
And those were his words. And so, yeah, it's interesting. And a lot of it did deal with ethnicity, because obviously different places in Europe, there are different ethnicities. Your religious beliefs sometimes came, if you were Scottish or German or what have you. And you got to remember, too, these were the descendants of people in Europe who had fought wars over Catholicism and Protestantism, and that there had been terrible persecution of Jews in Europe too. And so they were well aware of persecution based on religious beliefs, but it really was hard for them to think, I've got to tolerate someone else, not my minister, praying. And I know that sounds nuts to us because
Yeah,
we've come such a long way.
right. But
But
I mean,
and even in the last, I would say, 60 years, America's come a long way
oh,
in
certainly.
in a lot of that. When you look back at Kennedy and that religion was an issue for him, and it's just not like it, not anymore
Even
in that way.
Nixon was a Quaker, and that was
Yeah,
seemed to be trouble. Although we don't want to get too much into modern
right.
politics
I know,
and this
I know.
particular conversation, though I will add an addendum that you were saying how they had wars in Europe. I mean, you even look at Rhode Island was founded because the Puritans were too Puritan, and
Right,
I
that's
always like
true.
to yeah I always like to bring up the fact too that you know the Constitution got rid of federal state religion, but Connecticut was one of several states that had a state religion. I believe it was, I don't want to get it wrong. I believe it was the Congregationalist Connecticut,
Mm,
and
could have been.
until 1817 they had a state religion where your taxes were paying tithes, and Pierpont Edwards started the Toleration Party in Connecticut
Mm.
so that Episcopalians didn't have to pay tithes to Congregationalists. I know it's crazy. This is 30 years after the Constitution, but
Yeah,
I don't want to get too
but
off
that also
topic. But
just kind of goes back to the whole realization that that was an area that they had to learn to tolerate each other in the public sphere. That to work together. Because Maryland was founded by Catholics. It was a Catholic colony, so for it really does show you that when they came together as 13 different states, that they really were, it was like different nations in some ways.
yeah,
And that it was a big deal to them, and it's so commonplace now. But to have 13 different states, it was like 13 different countries to them.
that is essentially how they viewed themselves. That's why after the vote on independence in early July of 1776, a lot of those voters don't sign the Declaration a month later. They all run home to where it's important to do work to their home states. There's so many of them.
Yeah,
Robert Livingston in New York runs home. William Livingston of New Jersey. People who are not Livingston, Wisner. I could name names. It doesn't matter. um,
yeah,
yeah, and
yeah.
I want to go back. I do think it's a really interesting point to reiterate how you had said, I had never thought of it like this, but you said religion, it was the real diversity at the time, and that's a really fascinating way to look at it, because nowadays we don't really think of different denominations of Christianity as diverse, but at
Correct.
the
And
time the belief
yeah,
structure was
at the
so
time,
important.
they really did think, it really did divide them, and it was their struggle of having to get comfortable, because it's just easy to be segmented in their own community, and they were widening their world, and that was one area that they had to realize, okay, freedom of religion. And the fact that they didn't prescribe a religion, I think it also speaks, in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that they let that be free, compared to the fact that there was a Church of England. I think really speaks to their wisdom, and their confidence in what they did believe.
Right,
They weren't insecure about it, and so they were like, well, you know,
right.
I'm going to let it be free.
Well, it was the
And
peak of the Enlightenment,
yeah,
so
exactly.
they were
Exactly.
using enlightenment to inform their religious beliefs, which is fascinating.
Yeah. And you do see, George Washington reached out to a Hebrew congregation, a Jewish congregation when he was president. There's a famous letter that he wrote, and he wanted to extend the blessing of religious liberty, and so you do see them grow. And I
Right.
think that's the other thing that we miss sometimes about the founding is that we look at statues and we think a static image, but these people grew. They changed. They weren't the same as when they started. They grew in different areas, and that was one of the areas they grew in.
Right.
And then the other thing that I found about Duffield that I wrote about in my Stories of Faith and Courage book is that Duffield, at the end of the Revolution, they've got the peace treaty in December of 1783. So he preaches a message, and he chooses a passage from Isaiah about a nation being born in a day. And that's how he was looking at America as a nation just born in a day. And I thought, how could he do that? They just slogged through 8 years of turmoil. And yet he's able to just pan back. He talks about ancient history, how long the Israelites were in the desert 40 years. He was comparing numbers and dates. And he realized the 8 years was really just a quick, moment compared to the rest of history. And I thought that was really interesting that he could look at it that way, because when when it's in your face, it's hard to pan back and look at the big picture of history. But Duffield was able to do that.
Yeah.
And he died pretty young. I mean, he died pretty early. He didn't make it to the 1800s. He died in 1790. So that was a little earlier than I expected. I thought he might have, gone longer. But
Yeah. Well, back then, as through most of history, sometimes people just kind of died.
right.
It's not really that funny. I don't know why I'm laughing, but yeah,
I don't know why I'm laughing either, but it's just
it's
it
because I'm
is.
silly about it. That's why.
Yeah, well, and I guess George Washington passed away before the end of the century too. So, um, but so Duffield just has kept popping up in my world of research. He's in John Adams' writings. He's in the newspaper. So
Well, just to add one more comment, we were just talking about the Church of England a while ago, and
yeah,
I've read a little bit into it, and again, I'm not an expert on theology in any fashion,
right.
but I understand that if you celebrate the Church of England, and then you throw off England, then they've run into a little bit of trouble with that church. Do you happen to have any insight into how they may have handled that situation, or if not Duffield in particular?
Um,
I hope I'm not putting you on
they
the spot. I'm sorry.
one thing that I read that was really fascinating was a minister from the early, like I think even in the 1750s, 1760s, talked about how ecclesiastical tyranny was worse than governmental tyranny. And so I think there was a desire to be free of the church being the governing of everything in society, and so to have a civil government. So I think that that's probably how they differentiated it, because there were a lot of Anglican ministers that were really upset when the Church of England sent a lot of bishops over right before the war began, because they were trying to take control through the church. So I think there was this desire to have some independence as a church within a church, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that they were kind of wanting their Anglican church to be free too
Right.
from the Church of England.
Right. It's
So
one thing to have tyranny over your rights, but tyranny over your beliefs and your spirit is an entirely more
right.
horrifying thing in many fashions.
Right, because the Church of England wanted them to preach a sermon on the death of, I think, King Charles, who the Church of England saw was a martyr, but the Protestants in America, no, they didn't see him as a martyr. They saw him as a tyrant. So they didn't want to preach a sermon on his anniversary death Sunday. So there were conflicts within the church between the two continents that would pop up like that. So I think there was a little desire to get away from the governance structure.
Yeah, that
As
makes
well.
sense. Yeah, and what you were saying about bishops actually reminds me of William Livingston, who would later vote for independence but run home to be governor of New Jersey instead of signing the document. When he was younger, he worked with William Smith of Long Island and someone else whose name is eluding me, and they wrote a paper trying to stop King's College from being created because they didn't want a bishop being sent to New York City. A lot of that had to do with the Dutch heritage of New York too, but
That's
yeah,
interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
that makes
and
sense.
obviously that becomes Columbia and it's famous because Alexander Hamilton went there, but
Right.
and others, but yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. That's amazing. Is there anything else about Duffield that we should note?
No, I mean, I think that really covers it. That I did read that there was a bounty put on his head, and so that had to be, terrifying to know that the British were after him, and but just this belief that maybe it was God's providence that we should be separated from England, that impacted someone like John Adams in some way. I think just shows you that that people were really ready for independence. People in all walks of life. By the time we get to July, they've read Common Sense and Thomas Paine. They're talking about it in their churches. They're ready. And I know when I did a book called Resilience on Parade about Abigail Adams and the women who wanted voting rights. And one of the things I realized is that John and Abigail Adams would have been ready for independence in 1775. But they realized, oh, not everybody around me has this opinion. And so they were ready far earlier. And so that's one reason why I think Adams was really attuned to, okay, you're talking about it, Duffield's talking about it, people are ready.
Now's the time. That's amazing. Well, Jane, thank you so much for coming back. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Find us some other founders. Come back and chat again.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Founder fans, again, that's Jane Hampton Cook. There's a link to her article in the description below, also to all of her books. Buy them. There is a sale right now on Stories of Faith and Courage, so make sure you pick that up real quick before it is sold out. I want to say thank you again to Jane for coming, as always, and thank you for watching. If you made it this far, hit like and subscribe for a different founder every single day of the week, and I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.